Hi, this is Jeff Blauette, technical agronomist with Cooperative Farmers Elevator, and on this week's Field Friday segment, kind of end up having to do an off-site video, be a little different looking, maybe sound a little different, but we can talk about what we need to anyway. I thought we'd talk about, we're getting to that stage now where we can kind of go out into these cornfields if you're interested in getting a little bit of a hand yield estimate. So I thought I'd go over, there's two different methods that are commonly used. I guess the first one we've got where if we've got to go out doing hand yield checks and silage time before that corn is basically black layered, one of the more common methods is just doing the kernel count method. It's fairly simple. I've got a step-by-step procedure here. It'll basically remind you, but we basically got to figure out 1/1000th of an acre, what that length is with a tape measure, or step it off, whatever. Tape measure is probably more accurate, but how many plants have a good ear, not a nubbin? And that's going to be important this year because we did have an awful lot of uneven emergence because of the cool weather we had in May. So there's going to be some smaller plants there that have a nubbin, and I think we're going to want to maybe not count those. So our stand counts might be less than we planted by more than we're used to in some fields, but that's probably, it's going to be real. We're going to have lower yields in some of these fields because of it, and we're going to have, that be a factor. But basically you go out and get a count, maybe end up with 26, 28, 30, whatever your final count is. Then go out and grab every 5th or 6th ear, whatever you want to do as a random. Don't pick if you didn't count that plant because it had a nubbin on, then we're not going to grab that ear, we're not counting that. So grab every 5th ear or something like that, pull it off or count it on the stock, whatever you want to do. But then we're going to need to get an average kernel row. What's the diameter of that ear? So if it's got 16 or 18 rows around, that's what we're trying to get. We're going to need to do that on every ear, and then we need to get an average. What's the average number of kernel rows? That's the first component. The second is getting that average kernel count as far as how long that ear is. Is it 28, 32, 36, whatever? We need to get that count, and then same thing, we want an average, what we're getting. So we're going to have 5 ears, 5 counts, divide it by 5 to get an average kernel rows and an average kernel length. Once we do that, you can see in the formula, we've got how many ears that you counted, what's your average number of kernel rows, what's your average kernel length as far as how many kernels long, and then you got to divide it by a factor. Once you get that number, it's going to be a big number. We usually use somewhere between 80 and 90,000 kernels per bushel. If your average kernel row number is quite large, maybe you have a flexier style of hybrid that's 20 kernel rows on average. They're probably longer and thinner kernels. You may need to use a smaller or use more kernels per bushel because the kernels aren't quite so big, as opposed to if you have a hybrid that's got a nice deep kernel and 14 kernel rows, maybe we're going to use a different factor. So 80 to 90 if they're smaller kernels, or if the kernel depth doesn't look good, maybe 90, 95 in some cases in droughtier conditions, which we might have some of this year. Or if it looks really good, maybe you can use 80,000 or 85. But that's kind of you can follow this formula through and do your own math. But that's one method before black layer. Probably the more counts you do, the more accurate this is going to be. It's more work, but just like anything, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. The other one is the kernel weight, or the ear weight method, excuse me. Basically, we're going out in the same concept. We're going to figure out what our count is, how many countable ears we have. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to grab every 5th ear. This time we're going to pull them all off. A lot of times we'll take them off and have a piece of tape or rubber bands along, tape them together. Probably better with duct tape. You can record, what we're at in the field or whatever. Grab some sets of ears. Maybe it's 4 or 5 ears, whatever. And then we're going to take it back to the office or take it back to somewhere where we have a grain moisture tester. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have the average number of kernels, or the average number of ears, so our stand count. Then we're going to weigh each ear, and that's the ear before you shell it off. Is it a 1/2 pound, 6/10 of a pound? This really is more accurate once that kernel's black layered. We may not have any black layered corn around just yet, but we're probably getting close. If we're close to it, we'll probably still be fine. But we want to get that average ear weight, and then we want to have that shelled off and run it through a grain tester. And maybe you have to run it to the elevator to town. When you get into those higher moisture, a lot of hand testers aren't very accurate, but get an average moisture of that subset. You're probably going to need at least 3 years, probably 4 years as a minimum shelled off to get that, to have enough grain for a sample, but we need to get that average moisture. So you can see in this formula, we've got a couple of factors here that take into account some of the math behind the scenes to make this an accurate estimate. So basically at the end you're going to have how many ears times the weight, then take your factor times your moisture, which a lot of times we're doing it fairly early. It might be 28, 30, 32 depending on how early you do it, but right after black layer that's where you're going to probably be. Then you have another factor that you need to add to that number. And then you can kind of see the math here. That's how you're estimating your weighed ear, or your ear weight yield estimate for bushels. So you can try this, see how that works for you if you're really interested in checking out what the average corn yields are, and yeah, kind of see how things look in your field. So, and I guess with soybeans, we haven't figured out a way to do that other than combine it. There's no good way to do a yield estimate that doesn't take a boatload of time, and you're still not even probably close most of the time. But this is kind of something we're working on now. We're doing some yield checks, comparisons and stuff, and here's how to do it for corn in a couple different methods. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.